Hey there, I'm Josh, and this week I'm going to be just joshing around building this set of shelves. To design these shelves, I used Google SketchUp, more specifically the free version, which is browser-based. SketchUp is something I've been wanting to dabble in for a while now. It's a simple to use yet super complex design program that can seem a bit daunting at first unless you have some help with it, which, by the way, special thanks to my friend Ben for that because he really showed me the ropes on this. Anywho, I went with a really basic design for these shelves, and I'm making the entire set out of one single sheet of 3/4 inch sanded plywood. The first thing I'm doing is cutting down the sheet into 12-inch wide sections that will serve as the body of the shelves. One thing I had to consider is the kerf of the blade. For every piece that I cut, extra material was removed, which means that the last piece is going to end up being just a bit under 12 inches wide, which isn't a big deal because this is the piece that I'm going to be using for the actual shelves. So if they're offset a bit from the front of the main body, it'll still look fine. Once all the panels were cut down to their correct width, I started cutting all of the main pieces down to their dimensional lengths as well. The overall dimensions for this set of shelves will be 48 inches wide by 42 inches tall, with the idea being that each shelf will be able to hold two of those little fabric bin storage, you call it the little cube thingies, these things. Once I got all of the pieces cut down to their final size, I switched over to making marks on all of the main panels for where I'm going to be cutting out dados. That's dado, not dido.
My tea's gone cold, I'm wondering why.
Yeah. Yuck. It's terrible. And I suppose I should apologize to any of you who actually like Dido's music, but I guess we're all entitled to make some bad decisions once in a while. Because it's just terrible. Anywho, I got all the dados cut on the pieces, and now I'm going to start assembling. For the assembly, I'm using the same weld-bond glue that I used in the Beauty and the Beast wardrobe video. I'm just applying a liberal amount and then using the brad nailer to secure the piece in place. Throughout the assembly, I used a combination of corner clamps and this giant pipe clamp to hold everything in place. I was very careful to ensure that each joint was both square and secure. Once I got the bottom shelf in place, I installed the middle support. Once that piece was secured, I installed a cross member along the bottom. I didn't get any footage of this cross member being cut out, but it's basically a 3-inch by 46.5-inch piece of scrap that I'm using as a support for the bottom shelf. Once the top piece was installed, I used some wood filler to fill in all of the holes left behind from the brad nails. I hadn't ever used this brand of wood filler before, but I'm pretty happy with the results. While all the glue and wood filler was drying, I went to work on building a jig for all the shelf pins. I briefly thought about buying a shelf pin jig, but for $35 I figured,
how about new?
Not that $35 is a huge amount of money or anything, I just didn't feel like spending that much on a simple jig. So I decided to make my own. I'm using some scrap oak plywood that I had laying around. I cut two pieces to 12 by 3.5 inches and then glued and nailed them together. Once that was done, I marked out the placement for all of the holes. I'll be drilling 6 holes with each spaced 1.5 inches apart. The shelf pins I'll be using have a 1/4 inch diameter. However, for the holes in the jig, I'm using a 3/8 inch bit, and you'll see why here in a moment. I used the drill press to ensure that each hole was drilled straight and plumb. And the reason that I oversized the holes was for this. I cut down some scrap steel tubing to install into the holes. The tubing will act as a sleeve to ensure that the bit will not drift while drilling the holes for the pins. Next, I cut out a small strip to install perpendicular to the edge of the jig. This will act as a stop to ensure that the jig is square to the face of the main body of the shelves. I installed it using screws and then sanded the whole thing, and then it was done. To help ensure that the holes will be drilled to the correct depth, I attached a stop collar to the bit. And now it was time to start drilling some holes. I lined up the jig, clamped it into place, and then went to town. Then I repeated that same process 15 more times. Once all the holes were drilled, I carefully sanded every surface using 150 grit sandpaper. One thing to note is that this sanded plywood is only sanded that way on one side. So on the rougher side, I had to go over it with 80 grit sandpaper, but no big deal. Next, I'm getting into something I've never done before, edge banding. I've seen Bob Claggett use this stuff quite a bit before on his channel I Like to Make Stuff, and I've always wanted to try it out myself, so here was a perfect opportunity. As I've come to find out, this stuff is pretty simple to get onto, but kinda finicky to master. Basically, all you do is line up the veneer and then use an iron to press it on, and then trim away the excess. If done correctly, what you're left with is plywood that doesn't look like plywood, it looks like a solid board, so it's pretty cool. And one nice thing is that this stuff is pretty inexpensive. One roll contains 25 feet, and it costs about $7. It's actually pretty easy to work with too. If you make a mistake, you just heat it up, adjust your piece, and then press it back down. Simple as that. One thing I found that makes a nice finish is to use a sander to bevel the edges just a tiny bit. And while I was at it, I went over the entire set of shelves with a sander again using 240 grit sandpaper to get it nice and smooth. Before I stained the shelves, I used this pre-stain conditioner to ensure that the wood wouldn't have any blotchiness or anything. There wasn't anything too special about this stuff, you just apply it and then let it dry for a bit and then wipe off the excess. And then you're ready to stain. And for the stain, I'm using this golden oak shade. And again, just like the last step, there wasn't anything too special about this. I just applied it using a rag, let it sit for a while, and then wiped off the excess. One thing I forgot to mention is that after you use the conditioner, you are supposed to apply the stain within 2 hours. Which, of course, I did. I did only apply one coat of stain to this project because that's the color that I was wanting. I then let the stain dry overnight before attempting the next step with the polyurethane. Speaking of which, since I'm still kind of new to the finishing aspect of woodworking, I did a bit of research before this. And what I decided to do for the first coat was to do a 50-50 mixture of polyurethane and mineral spirits. For the second coat, I used a 3-to-1 mixture, and for the final coat, I used full strength. Between each coat, I allowed 4 hours of dry time and lightly sanded every surface using ultra-fine steel wool. I then cleaned away all of the dust, and then applied the next coat, and repeated the process until it was done. Once everything was dry, I started putting it all together. The shelf pins I'm using are the simple zinc-coated ones that you can buy at Walmart for like $3. Nothing fancy here, you've all seen them before. They're good at holding shelves, so that's a plus, right? My wife just picked up some of these fabric bins on the cheap, so I just set them on the shelves for the time being. I'm sure things are going to get reorganized and moved around. In fact, they already have. These shelves will suit our purposes really well, and with the cost of building materials under $60, I really can't complain. Well, I've only ever made a few pieces of furniture, and this is my first set of shelves. Having said that, I'm pretty impressed with how they look, and they're really sturdy. I'm certainly glad that I put the time and effort into building these shelves that I did, because the quality shows through. In fact, I think they look like something you'd buy at a nice furniture store. Plus, it's always good to learn and practice different skills like wood staining and finishing and structural building. Skills that I'll definitely be using more of in the future. But what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. And that does it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and if you did, please be sure to like and subscribe. And at the risk of sounding like a broken record, share it with somebody. That always helps. Thanks for watching, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time.